You settle in for the night, the soft hum of your room, a quiet backdrop as the world outside fades away. Dim the lights, turn down the volume, and wrap yourself in a blanket. I'm Silas Whitmore, and tonight we're drifting across centuries to wander through the courts of Europe's most bizarre kingsmen, who commanded armies, built empires, and yet often made choices so absurd you'll wonder how their crowns ever stayed on their heads. These aren't stories of great battles or brilliant statecraft. These are the rulers who believed they were made of glass, turned their palaces into endless revels, and sometimes drove their barons to invent democracy just to keep their wives safe. They're reminders that power doesn't erase foolishness, and that history, for all its grandeur, is often far stranger and more human than we expect. So let your mind drift as we wander through gilded halls and shadowed chambers where chaos and comedy shared a throne. If you like my video, comment number 1. If you don't like my video, hit the like button. And as always, tell me in the comments where and when you're listening tonight, whether it's late in the city, quiet in the countryside, with someone by your side, or all on your own, letting these tales carry you towards sleep. Tonight, our journey begins in medieval England, where one king's appetites were so reckless, his own nobles didn't just rebel, they wrote a charter to protect their families from him. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and follow me into the past where crowns gleamed, tempers flared, and history never bothered to behave. You let your breathing slow as the scene forms in your mind. England, the early 1200s, where the mists cling to gray castles and the crown rests on the head of John, called Lackland. You hear the echo of his footsteps along cold stone corridors, but it isn't war or diplomacy that worries his nobles tonight. It's the sound of those footsteps coming down the hall toward their families. John was no stranger to failure. He lost Normandy, Anjou, Maine, half of the lands his ancestors had fought to keep. He bled his barons for taxes, fought costly wars, and left England weary. But what made him truly infamous wasn't the wars he lost or the money he demanded. It was the women he pursued, the households he shattered, and the way he treated the nobility's wives and daughters as though they were another sort of tribute owed to the crown. He didn't court. He didn't woo. He took. Noble women vanished into royal castles, guests of the king, until they were quietly married off or simply forgotten. Husbands found themselves not only humiliated, but find he had a habit of doubling a man's taxes after humiliating him in his own hall, a royal insult dressed up as administration. Chroniclers' men who typically turned a blind eye to executions and witch trials wrote with open disgust he did not abstain from wives and daughters. That was medieval code for the king, made every Christmas feast unbearable. His behavior drove the nobility to desperation. These weren't men rising in outrage over taxation alone. These were lords terrified to leave their homes undefended when the king arrived. One baron refused to meet John unless his entire household was locked behind gates, first like valuables being secured before a raid. The threat wasn't rebellion. It was embarrassment, betrayal, the gnawing dread of a monarch who saw no boundary between his crown and anyone else's marriage vows. In 1215, the tension snapped. The barons forced John to sign the Magna Carta, a document remembered as a cornerstone of liberty, but in its more personal subtext as a desperate barrier between a king and his appetites. It set limits not only on taxation, but indirectly on John himself. The barons didn't just want laws, they wanted locks on their doors that even the king couldn't ignore. As you drift, you can almost picture him, a sullen king at Runnymede pen in hand, glaring not at the clauses on trade and justice, but at the invisible leash tightening around his whims. He would die a year later, sick and beaten, leaving behind a kingdom simmering with distrust and a reputation so toxic it birthed a legend, a monarch so unruly his people practically invented democracy to keep him from stealing their daughters. Now let your thoughts soften like the river mists. If John unsettled the halls of England, wait until you meet a king of France who thought the greatest threat to his reign was a stiff breeze and an accidental bump. The air grows still as your thoughts drift south across the Channel into the heart of France at the dawn of the 1400s. Paris bustles outside the palace walls, but inside King Charles V, I moves like a ghost wrapped in layers of padded cloth. You watch as servants shuffle behind him, careful not to startle their monarch, careful not to touch him. He isn't afraid of assassins or conspirators tonight. He is afraid of breaking. Charles believed with all the fragile conviction of a frightened child that his body was made of glass. The ailment wasn't a passing notion, it consumed him. He would sit for hours still, as a statue begging his attendants to avoid sudden movements lest he shatter. Layers of quilts and cushions became his daily armor, a strange contrast to the gilded halls of the French court. He wasn't a king in shining mail, but in soft padding, as though a stumble might undo the entire monarchy. Yet even wrapped like a fragile vessel, Charles's reign wasn't quiet. His mind unraveled in ways that spread far beyond his padded chamber. He lashed out unpredictably, striking at his own knights in wild fits. He ran screaming from mirrors, convinced they plotted against him. And in moments of lucidity, he still tried to maintain the image of a proper monarch, hosting grand court festivities that could turn catastrophic with a single spark. One such evening became legend, the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. Charles and several courtiers, dressed as wild men in costumes coated with flammable pitch and feathers, danced through the hall to entertain the court. The torches flickered laughter, echoed, and then chaos. A stray flame leapt, a costume ignited, and the revel turned to a nightmare. Courtiers screamed fire, devoured fabric, and 4 men burned alive before the music stopped. Charles survived, saved by a quick-thinking duchess who smothered him beneath her skirts, but whatever dignity remained was scorched away. His Queen Isabeau of Bavaria endured it all, the glass delusion, the bursts of violence, the spectacle of a king who could neither lead nor be left alone. She managed the realm as best she could, smiling through a court that whispered, pitied, and feared their monarch in equal measure. Charles fathered 12 children, despite his breaks from reality, though few could say if he remembered their names when his mind drifted into shadow. As you breathe deeper, picture him, not as a tyrant, but as a man adrift, a king whose greatest battle was with his own mind. The court tiptoed around him, not out of respect, but out of fear, fear of breaking him, fear of his sudden rage, fear of a monarchy balanced on cushions and delusion. Now keep your eyes closed and follow me south to a land where another king ruled not with fragility, but with a jealousy so fierce it bled into cruelty, and love became as dangerous as war. The air turns warmer as your thoughts drift to Castile in the mid-1300 SA land of sunlit palaces and whispered fears. Here King Peter rules a monarch whose passions burn hotter than the Spanish summer and far more dangerously. The courtiers call him the cruel, or for those hoping to keep their heads, the just. Which one you chose depended largely on whether you were standing beside him or beneath his execution balcony. Peter's obsession was not his throne, nor his kingdom's borders, but Maria de Padilla, a noblewoman with striking beauty and a quiet strength that captivated him completely. Even as his advisors arranged diplomatic marriages, Peter's heart and his fury remained tethered to her. When he married Blanche of Bourbon, a French princess chosen for alliance, the union lasted just 3 days before Blanche was locked in a castle for life. Her offense, not her politics, but simply not being Maria. Maria, for her part, became Peter's anchor and his excuse. He clung to her presence, even as whispers spread that his devotion had turned toxic. When rivals challenged him, Peter's wrath was swift and theatrical. He didn't simply punish his enemies, he staged their ends. He would lounge on a balcony, Maria by his side, watching as executions unfolded in the courtyard, below a glass of wine in hand. It wasn't justice. It was spectacle. One mistress, Duewana, tried to leave him. Her remains were found scattered, a silent warning to anyone who thought to deny the king. His enemies, cousins, and even distant courtiers suffered similar fates, their deaths less acts of law than of mood. His court, awash with gossip and fear, became a place where love and vengeance blurred until they were indistinguishable. Even allies couldn't be sure whether Peter's smile meant affection or a prelude to ruin. In the end, his cruelty drew its own reckoning. His half-brother Henry of Trastevere rose in rebellion, fueled as much by family hatred as by political ambition. When they met at Montiel in 1369, Henry didn't just defeat Peter, he personally killed him, ending the reign of Castile's most fearsome lover and most dangerous monarch in one stroke. As your breath steadies, picture that final moment, a king brought low not by foreign armies or divine judgment, but by the brother who had grown tired of his obsessions and his blood-soaked court. Peter's legacy lingered, not as a tale of romance, nor even as a warning, but as a dark reminder that a king's heart left unchecked can be deadlier than his sword. Now let yourself drift across the channel once more to England, where the next king's passions weren't for women at all, and the scandal that followed would shake his throne more than any battlefield ever could. Breathe in slowly as your thoughts cross back over the sea to England in the early 1300s, where the halls of Westminster echo not with the clamor of strategy or statecraft, but with whispers of scandal. King Edward he rules here, but his reign is remembered less for battles and policies, and more for the companions he cherished, men whose presence at court stirred more fury than any invading army could. Edward's first favorite was Piers Gaveston, a childhood companion whose charm and boldness matched the king's devotion. Piers was not content to remain a quiet confidant. Edward showered him with titles, estates, and gifts, so extravagant they glittered brighter than the queen's own regalia. At Edward's coronation, Piers wore jewels that drew every eye and every murmur, upstaging Queen Isabella herself. In a court where appearances meant survival, Gaveston's sparkle lit the fuse of noble resentment. The barons demanded his exile more than once. Edward wept, sulked, and reluctantly sent Piers away, only to call him back with even greater honors, like a lovesick youth, ignoring every warning. The pattern repeated until the nobles, exasperated, captured and executed Gaveston. Edward's grief was public and consuming. He donned mourning clothes, paraded his sorrow, and poured the weight of his heartbreak onto a kingdom already straining under weak leadership. But his devotion did not fade, it simply shifted. Hugh Despenser the Younger rose to fill the void-wielding influence, so vast he was dubbed the Second King. Whole counties fell under his control, and the Despensers' greed and cruelty fanned noble hatred into open flames. Queen Isabella, long scorned and sidelined, transformed from neglected spouse to avenger. Aligning herself with her own lover Roger Mortimer, she raised an army and marched against Edward and Hugh. The end was as brutal as it was inevitable. Edward was captured, forced to abdicate, and imprisoned. Hugh Despenser was executed in a spectacle so gruesome it drew shocked gasps, even in an age accustomed to public punishment. Edward's death remains shrouded in rumor, whispers of a red-hot poker, a punishment too lurid for certainty, but vivid enough to stain his legacy forever. As your breath settles, you can almost hear the murmurs in those drafty halls, not of treaties or royal decrees, but of scandal, betrayal, and a love that proved more dangerous than any sword. Let your mind soften and drift eastward now toward Bohemia, where the next king's vices weren't whispered. In corners they were shouted over overflowing goblets as the court descended into chaos. The rhythm of your breath deepens as your thoughts travel east into Bohemia, In the waning years of the 14th century, the court of King Wenceslaus doesn't hum with the quiet formality of royal councils. It rattles with laughter, clinking goblets, and the occasional thud of a toppled chair. Here the king himself is less a monarch and more a host presiding over his realm with a wine cup in hand, and often little else. Wenceslaus was crowned with promise, intelligent, multilingual, and politically capable. But the crown heavy with duty soon felt more like an inconvenience than a calling. He found greater comfort at the bottom of a goblet than on the throne, and his palace became a perpetual feast. Nobles, envoys, and unfortunate courtiers were summoned not for policy, but for parties that stretched through the night, where state business was slurred between toasts and arguments ended with overturned tables or impromptu duels using whatever was close at hand, sometimes breadsticks, sometimes swords. As the king's appetites grew, so did his disregard for royal decorum. Wenceslaus developed a peculiar fondness for delivering decrees while entirely unclothed, save for a sword belt slung across his hips. One chronicler, clearly unimpressed, wrote clothes, he said, were for the timid. And in that court, few were bold enough to argue with a tipsy king holding a blade, even if his dignity was long gone. Romantically, his interests followed his habits, favoring barmaids, laundresses, and any woman within arm's reach during his revels. Affairs weren't whispered scandals. They were part of the entertainment. Accusations flew, tempers flared, but Wenceslaus would simply shrug, pour another drink, and dare anyone to object. Diplomacy with him often ended not in treaties, but in drinking contests, leaving foreign envoys staggering back to their quarters, wondering if they'd just negotiated or simply survived. In time, even his own nobles could no longer mask their contempt. The crown's business stalled, alliances crumbled, and his drunken spectacles turned from amusing to alarming. His brother and the Bohemian aristocracy, weary of watching their kingdom stumble under a ruler who seemed permanently intoxicated, finally intervened. Wenceslaus was deposed, his crown handed to steadier hands, while he drifted into the annals of history as the monarch who ruled more from a wine barrel than a throne. Now, as you exhale slowly, picture the dim glow of his court, half celebration, half slow motion collapse, and let the noise fade into quiet. Ahead lies England once more, where another king's passions would carve far deeper marks, not with goblets and laughter, but with divorce, betrayal, and the creation of an entirely new church to soothe his heart. Your breath steadies as you drift back to England, this time in the early 1500s, where the shadow of the Tudor rose falls over a court, both magnificent and merciless. Here stands Henry V, a king who would shape religion itself, not for the salvation of souls, but for the sake of his heart, and more precisely his need for a son. Henry began his reign as the golden monarch, tall, broad-shouldered, charming, a patron of music and sport, and a king who seemed destined to lead with strength. Yet beneath the splendor, his obsession brewed a desperation for a male heir to secure the Tudor line. His first queen, Catherine of Aragon, gave him one surviving daughter, Mary, but no sons. 20 years of marriage ended not with grief, but with a seismic rift. Convinced God cursed him for marrying his brother's widow, Henry sought annulment. When the Pope refused, Henry didn't compromise. He simply built a new church. The creation of the Church of England was less a theological revelation and more a royal workaround. By severing ties with Rome, Henry gained his annulment and married Anne Boleyn, whose wit and ambition matched his own. But Anne, like Catherine, produced no surviving sons, only a daughter, Elizabeth, who would one day outshine them all. Accusations of adultery, witchcraft, and betrayal followed, ending with Anne's head on the executioner's block. Henry mourned briefly, then married Jane Seymour, who finally delivered the son he craved, Edward, before dying in childbirth. The pattern continued like a grim refrain. Anne of Cleves dismissed after 6 months, because Henry deemed her appearance unworthy, Catherine Howard executed for adultery, while the king, aging gout-ridden and paranoid, still fancied himself irresistible, and finally Catherine Parr, who survived by being patient, literate, and careful enough to sidestep accusations until Henry's death. By the end, Henry's court was less a royal seat and more a stage for a dark comedy where alliances rose and fell on whispers and wedding vows felt as dangerous as war oaths. He left England with a son too young to rule a treasury, strained, and a reputation as the king who rewrote faith itself to soothe his pride and quell his fear of a legacy ending without a boy to bear his name. Let your eyes grow heavier as the Tudor music fades. Ahead lies France, where another king wielded morality, not as devotion, but as a weapon punishing others for sins, while quietly indulging in his own. In the late 1200s, France had a king whose looks earned him the title Philip the Fair, though his reign revealed that fairness had nothing to do with justice. Outwardly, Philip Ivy projected piety and order. He stood as a model of moral authority, stern and composed a ruler who spoke of virtue and discipline. Behind the marble mask, however, his court ran on double standards, and his enemies, real or imagined, suffered beneath the weight of those contradictions. Philip's most notorious act of hypocrisy was not whispered but blazoned across the continent. When rumors surfaced that two of his daughters-in-law were exchanging more than pleasantries with certain knights, he moved with brutal efficiency. The scandal known as the Tour de Nesle affair became a royal purge. The princesses accused of adultery were imprisoned, their heads shaved, their titles stripped. The knights less fortunate were tortured, mutilated, and publicly executed, their bodies left as warnings to any who dared dishonor the crown. Yet, even as Philip thundered about purity and the sanctity of marriage, whispers followed him through the Louvre's corridors. Some claimed he kept mistresses tucked away in private chambers, women introduced as gifts for visiting dignitaries under the guise of diplomacy. None of these women were ever publicly acknowledged, nor were they punished. In Philip's France, sin was not a crime if it was convenient. It became strategy, another tool in the king's carefully balanced rule. His moral crusades extended beyond the family. In 1307, burdened by debts from costly wars, Philip turned his gaze toward the Knights Templar, an order wealthy enough to rival monarchs, answerable only to the Pope. Accusations poured forth idol worship, heresy, obscene rituals. Most of it was invention, but superstition and fear did the work Philip needed. Thousands of Templars were arrested on a single October morning, tortured until confessions spilled out and stripped of everything they owned. Their order was dissolved, their wealth seized, their leaders burned. Philip's legacy was not of fairness, but of calculation. He was the king who weaponized virtue, condemning others, while indulging himself, crafting a reign where morality bent to royal need. His beauty may have earned him his name, but it was his cold pragmatism and the fires he lit that defined his rule. Beyond the palaces of Paris, another monarch would discard even the pretense of restraint. Cross back to England now, where a king embraced his vices, openly turning his court into something that resembled less a kingdom and more an endless masquerade. Step into Restoration England, 1660, where the gloom of Puritan rule has lifted, and Charles II, freshly restored to the throne, seems less interested in rebuilding the kingdom and more determined to make up for every dull year England endured. Nicknamed the Merry Monarch, Charles did not simply allow indulgence, he made it the cornerstone of his reign. His court was unlike any England had seen, a place where formality gave way to flirtation and royal audiences blurred into evening revels. Mistresses were not hidden, they were part of the spectacle. Nell Gwynn, a sharp-tongued actress who called herself the Protestant to stand out from Charles's Catholic favorites, became a favorite of the public, almost as much as she was of the king. Barbara Palmer, brazen and unapologetic, lived openly in royal apartments and bore him multiple children, each rewarded with titles and lands, as if the monarchy itself had adopted nepotism as policy. Charles even redesigned Whitehall Palace to accommodate his liaisons, adding a private corridor so his mistresses could come and go without disrupting ambassadors or state business. Not that state business was ever truly undisturbed, many government pensions flowed directly to these women as if they were unofficial ministers of merriment. Foreign envoys, scandalized yet fascinated, wrote home about a court where the line between diplomacy and dalliance barely existed. Queen Catherine of Braganza endured it all with a stoicism that bordered on saintly. She bore no surviving children yet. Charles reportedly remarked, "She has never given me trouble," a compliment so skewed it felt more like an epitaph for royal marriage than a gesture of affection. In contrast, Charles fathered at least 14 illegitimate children, most of whom he acknowledged and showered with privilege, while the legitimate royal line dwindled. Yet for all the impropriety, the people loved him. Charles reopened theaters, encouraged music and art, and turned the monarchy into something vivid, colorful, and alive again. To a nation weary of gray sermons and rigid laws, his court's laughter, even with all its excess, felt like a relief. When he died in 1685, his final words were not a command for the crown, but a plea for one of his mistresses, "Let not poor Nellie starve." A monarch to the end, but one whose legacy was as much champagne and scandal as it was governance. Beyond Whitehall's revels, the mood turns darker. To the north in Sweden, another king's banquets would end not with toasts, but with terror as suspicion and rage turned dinner tables into battlegrounds. Northward now to Sweden, in the 1560 S, where the long cold nights of the north seemed to mirror the shadows creeping through King Erik XIV's mind. At first glance, he appeared every inch the Renaissance ruler, tall, handsome, fascinated by astronomy and the arts, even known to pen love poetry between state duties. But behind the measured stanzas and celestial charts, paranoia spread like frost across his thoughts, chilling his court and turning once civil suppers into arenas of dread. Eric's reign began with promise. He courted alliances with great powers, pursued learning, and showed a curiosity rare among monarchs of his day. But that curiosity twisted inward, becoming an obsession with signs, omens, and the shifting loyalties of his nobles. He consulted astrologers before making decisions, convinced the stars whispered of betrayal. When his fears grew reason, shrank, and his temper became as dangerous as his crown. The most infamous outburst came at what should have been a simple dinner. Among his guests were members of the Stuart family, influential nobles, whose power and whispers of dissent gnawed at Eric's nerves. The gathering began politely, wine-poured dishes served, but the mood tightened as Eric's suspicions took hold. Convinced Sturs plotted against him, he snapped. Drawing a blade, he struck one of the nobles at the table, and chaos erupted. Courtiers scrambled, servants froze, and the feast turned into a blood-soaked spectacle. From that night onward, fear gripped the court. The king roamed the halls with wild eyes, hearing voices suspecting betrayal in every corner. He donned disguises to spy on his own council, slipping through Stockholm streets like a phantom in royal boots, as if paranoia could be soothed by playing the commoner. The nobles, already shaken, finally acted. Eric was seized, deposed by his own brother, and confined to a castle where his fears could no longer spill into the kingdom he once ruled. He died in captivity in 1577, likely poisoned, though some whisper he simply succumbed to the weight of his unraveling mind. Erik XIV remains a lesson carved in shadow, a king whose intellect and sensitivity, left unchecked by reason, turned his court into a place where dinner could end with a dirge, and where the throne itself felt as unstable as his own thoughts. Far to the south, another ruler found a different outlet for fear and control. In Naples, a king turned his dread of rebellion into something tangible, preserved, posed, and displayed in a gallery where silence spoke louder than screams. Travel now to Naples in the late 1400s, where King Ferdinand, often called Ferrante, ruled with a mixture of charm, cunning, and a taste for the macabre. To his subjects, he could be a capable ruler, shoring up finances and suppressing rebellions with speed. To his enemies, he was a specter, a sovereign whose methods of control went far beyond the battlefield. For those who crossed him, death was not the end, it was the beginning of a final unsettling display. Ferdinand's court was outwardly refined, full of music feasts and diplomacy. But beneath the gilded chambers lay a chamber of horrors that became infamous across Europe, the Black Room, a private gallery where rebellion met its most chilling consequence. After crushing plots and punishing traitors, Ferdinand didn't simply bury the bodies. He had them embalmed and preserved, arranged as if still alive, frozen mid-scream, or seated in mock conversation, their crimes etched on plaques beneath their stiffened feet. Ambassadors, nobles, and would-be conspirators were ushered through this silent hall, a tour meant to ensure loyalty. Accounts describe Ferdinand himself guiding visitors, speaking casually. About each figure here stands the duke who mistook rebellion for courage. Here the knight who plotted while smiling at my table. Some guests fainted, others left pale and trembling. The lesson burned into their minds more vividly than any decree. It was a museum of warning, a silent reminder that treachery under Ferdinand's reign did not fade quietly into the grave. Beyond this chilling display, the king's personal life added to his notoriety. His official queen was one among many companions, as Ferdinand fathered numerous illegitimate children, each finding a place in his expanding network of influence. Banquets often doubled as opportunities for flirtation, where political guests quickly learned that the king's attentions were as unpredictable as his methods of control. Yet, for all his grim theatrics, Ferdinand was not hated by all. His people admired his strength. His nobles, even in fear, respected his resolve. He ruled for decades, dying peacefully in bed, leaving behind a kingdom steadied by fear and cunning, and a legacy marked by that eerie gallery where silence and glass-eyed stares spoke louder than any crown. From the dim corridors of Naples, follow now to Versailles, where another king would trade terror for indulgence, turning his palace not into a mausoleum, but into something resembling a royal recruiting hall for mistresses. Shift now to Versailles in the 1700s, where grandeur and excess mingle beneath gilded ceilings, and King Louis XVI, the beloved, reigns in a palace that feels less like the heart of a kingdom and more like a stage for endless intrigue. Though his youth promised a stable continuation of his great-grandfather's legacy, Louis XVI allowed his private appetites to eclipse his duties, transforming Versailles into something closer to a private theater of desire than a seat of governance. Louis's most infamous indulgence was the Parche aux Cerfs, a discreet house near Versailles used to host what many quietly called his auditions. Young women, often from modest families, were recruited for his favor, sometimes rotated through the arrangement like seasonal appointments. Each was given gifts, titles, or housing when her tenure ended, a system as organized as it was scandalous, operating like a shadow institution beneath the glittering fayade of the Sun King's palace. To the outside world, this was a whisper, but within France, everyone knew the king's heart, and much of his energy was rarely with matters of state. Madame de Pompadour, his most famous official mistress, wielded influence far beyond the bedroom. Though she eventually stepped away from their physical relationship, she remained his confidant and advisor, steering cultural and political currents while Louis sought younger distractions elsewhere. Meanwhile, Queen Marie Lescaut became a distant figure, sidelined after her childbearing years, a silent fixture at ceremonies, while the king's attentions wandered openly. The court adjusted. Nobles no longer whispered about whether the king had a mistress, but how many. Ambassadors recorded the turnover in coded letters, noting that Versailles functioned as much as a salon of power as a carousel of romance. While the king's charm shielded him from outright revolt, the cracks beneath the gold spread, a treasury bleeding from wars and indulgence, and a court whose priorities drifted far from the nation's struggles. By the time Louis XV died in 1774, France was weighed down by debt disillusionment and the lingering perception that the monarchy cared more for silks and soirees than for its people. His reign didn't collapse in his lifetime, but it set the stage for the storm that would claim his grandson Louis XVI, and with him, the monarchy itself. From Versailles' perfumed halls, our path leads north to Denmark, where another king would leave a different impression, not through grandeur or indulgence, but through absence, as his mind fractured and others quietly took his throne in all but name. Our final stop is Copenhagen in the late 1700s, where the Danish court revolved around a king more mascot than monarch. Christian I inherited the throne in 1766, young and seemingly poised to lead, but it soon became clear that his crown sat on a mind unraveling. Severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, made him unpredictable, erratic, and more a figure of curiosity than command. Christian's behavior veered from unsettling to absurd. He would disappear from state dinners to gallop through palace corridors on imaginary horses, shout at his own hand as if it were a conspirator, and indulge in public displays of self-gratification, leaving foreign dignitaries staring into their wine cups and wondering how to report such scenes back home. The king's antics were not just embarrassing, they left Denmark functionally rudderless. Into this void stepped Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's physician, a man of sharp intellect and sharper ambition. Struensee became Christian's caretaker advisor, and in all but name, the ruler of Denmark. He soothed the king with puppet shows, and games distracted him from sharp objects, and used the resulting freedom to introduce sweeping reforms, modernizing laws, curbing noble privileges, and quietly reshaping the state. Meanwhile, Struensee began a scandalous affair with Queen Caroline Matilda Christian's English-born wife. The relationship at first, whispered soon, became impossible to ignore, as the two governed in tandem, while the king wandered humming to himself in palace gardens. Their union produced a child whose paternity was a matter of gossip, but not mystery. For a brief moment, Denmark became a strange blend of Enlightenment ideals and soap opera intrigue. The arrangement could not last. The Dowager Queen Juliana Maria bristled at Struensee's power and the open scandal. In 1772, she orchestrated a coup. Struensee was arrested, executed, after a brutal trial, and Caroline Matilda was exiled, left to live out her days far from the court she had briefly controlled. Christian, stripped of the only figures who gave his reign direction, slipped further into managed obscurity. Surrounded by caretakers, he remained king in title until his death in 1808, but Denmark was governed by others. History remembers him not for policies or wars, but as the monarch whose reign functioned like a stage play where the star was silent and the supporting cast ran the kingdom. From Copenhagen's quiet halls, we leave behind our parade of monarchs, 12 rulers bound not by their achievements, but by their follies, each a reminder that the crown has never guaranteed wisdom or dignity. The crowns have dimmed, the voices faded, and the last flicker of torchlight from Copenhagen's quiet halls drifts into darkness. 12 kings spread across centuries and kingdoms, each left a mark, not through heroism or brilliant statecraft, but through folly, obsession, and the strange shadows that power often casts. From John's reckless appetites that helped birth a charter to Charles V, patting himself against a world he feared might shatter him, to monarchs who turned palaces into theaters of indulgence or terror, these rulers remind us that history rarely behaves like a neat parade of noble figures. Power, for all its splendor, doesn't erase human weakness. It magnifies it. Some of these kings ruled with cruelty, others with chaos, some barely ruled at all. Yet their stories endure because they make the distant past feel oddly familiar. They are not marble statues, flawless and cold, but figures as flawed and impulsive as anyone, only with crowns on their heads and kingdoms beneath their feet. As the echoes of their courts fade, let yourself rest. These scandals, these bursts of madness and indulgence, are centuries behind us now. Dust on old tapestries, whispers in half-forgotten halls. What remains is only the soft hum of history, a reminder that even the mightiest of rulers can stumble, blunder, or amuse us long after their empires have crumbled. If you've stayed with me to the end, share where and when you're listening tonight. Maybe it's late in the city, or quiet in a dark countryside, or somewhere in between as you drift toward sleep. I'm Silas Whitmore, and I'll be here again with more tales where history lets its guard down and shows its stranger, softer side. Sleep well, because if history has taught us anything tonight, it's that even kings can make us laugh as we close our eyes.